This essay is dedicated to Pascal Pia and is organized in 4 chapters and 1 appendix. Chapter 1. An Absurd Reasoning. Camus undertakes the task of answering what he considers to be the only question of philosophy that matters. Does the realization of the meaninglessness and absurdity of life necessarily require suicide? He begins by describing the following absurd condition. We build our life on the hope for tomorrow, yet tomorrow brings us closer to death and is the ultimate enemy. People live their lives as if they were not aware of the certainty of death. Once stripped of its common romanticism, the world is a foreign, strange, and inhuman place. True knowledge is impossible, and rationality and science cannot explain the world. Their stories ultimately end in meaningless abstractions, in metaphors. This is the absurd condition, and from the moment absurdity is recognized, it becomes a passion, the most harrowing of all. It is not the world that is absurd, nor human thoughts. The absurd arises when the human need to understand meets the unreasonableness of the world, when the appetite for the absolute and for unity meets the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle. He then characterizes several philosophies that describe and attempt to deal with this feeling of the absurd, by Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Lev Shestov, Søren Kierkegaard, and Edmund Husserl. All of these, he claims, commit philosophical suicide by reaching conclusions that contradict the original absurd position, either by abandoning reason and turning to God, as in the case of Kierkegaard and Shestov, or by elevating reason and ultimately arriving at ubiquitous Platonic forms and an abstract God, as in the case of Husserl. For Camus, who sets out to take the absurd seriously and follow it to its final conclusions, these leaps cannot convince. Taking the absurd seriously means acknowledging the contradiction between the desire of human reason and the unreasonable world. Suicide, then, must also be rejected. Without man, the absurd cannot exist. The contradictions must be lived. Reason and its limits must be acknowledged, without false hope. However, the absurd can never be permanently accepted. It requires constant confrontation, constant revolt. While the question of human freedom in the metaphysical sense loses interest to the absurd man, he gains freedom in a very concrete sense. No longer bound by hope for a better future or eternity, without a need to pursue life's purpose or to create meaning, he enjoys a freedom with regard to common rules. To embrace the absurd implies embracing all that the unreasonable world has to offer. Without meaning in life, there is no scale of values. What counts is not the best living, but the most living. Thus, Camus arrives at 3 consequences from fully acknowledging the absurd: revolt, freedom, and passion. Chapter 2. The Absurd Man. How should the absurd man live? Clearly, no ethical rules apply, as they are all based on higher powers or on justification. Integrity has no need of rules. Everything is permitted. It is not an outburst of relief or joy, but rather a bitter acknowledgement of a fact. Camus then goes on to present examples of the absurd life. He begins with Don Juan, the serial seducer who lives the passionate life to the fullest. There is no noble love but that which recognizes itself to be both short-lived and exceptional. The next example is the actor, who depicts ephemeral lives for ephemeral fame. He demonstrates to what degree appearing creates being. In those 3 hours, he travels the whole course of the dead-end path that the man in the audience takes a lifetime to cover. Camus' third example of the absurd man is the conqueror, the warrior who forgoes all promises of eternity to affect and engage fully in human history. He chooses action over contemplation, aware of the fact that nothing can last and no victory is final. Chapter 3. Absurd Creation. Here, Camus explores the absurd creator or artist. Since explanation is impossible, absurd art is restricted to a description of the myriad experiences in the world. If the world were clear, art would not exist. Absurd creation, of course, also must refrain from judging and from alluding to even the slightest shadow of hope. He then analyzes the work of Fyodor Dostoevsky in this light, especially The Diary of a Writer, The Possessed, and The Brothers Karamazov. All these works start from the absurd position, and the first 2 explore the theme of philosophical suicide. However, both the diary and his last novel, The Brothers Karamazov, ultimately find a path to hope and faith, and thus fail as truly absurd creations. Chapter 4. The Myth of Sisyphus. In the last chapter, Camus outlines the legend of Sisyphus, who defied the gods and put death in chains so that no human needed to die. When death was eventually liberated and it came time for Sisyphus himself to die, he concocted a deceit which let him escape from the underworld. After finally capturing Sisyphus, the gods decided that his punishment would last for all eternity. He would have to push a rock up a mountain. Upon reaching the top, the rock would roll down again, leaving Sisyphus to start over. Camus sees Sisyphus as the absurd hero who lives life to the fullest, hates death, and is condemned to a meaningless task. Camus presents Sisyphus' ceaseless and pointless toil as a metaphor for modern lives spent working at futile jobs in factories and offices. The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Camus is interested in Sisyphus' thoughts when marching down the mountain to start anew. After the stone falls back down the mountain, Camus states that it is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that toils so close to stones is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a heavy yet measured step toward the torment of which he will never know the end. This is the truly tragic moment when the hero becomes conscious of his wretched condition. He does not have hope, but there is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. Acknowledging the truth will conquer it. Sisyphus, just like the absurd man, continues pushing. Camus claims that when Sisyphus acknowledges the futility of his task and the certainty of his fate, he is freed to realize the absurdity of his situation and to reach a state of contented acceptance. With a nod to the similarly cursed Greek hero Oedipus, Camus concludes that all is well indeed, that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Appendix. The essay contains an appendix titled Hope and the Absurd in the Work of Franz Kafka. While Camus acknowledges that Kafka's work represents an exquisite depiction of the absurd condition, he mentions that Kafka fails as an absurd writer because his work retains a glimmer of hope.